The air was thick with a sense of unease as the sun dipped below the horizon. The small town of Everwood was usually a peaceful place, a town where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But tonight, something was different. A fog had rolled in, heavy and suffocating, clinging to the ground like a damp blanket. The wind carried an eerie stillness, and even the crickets seemed to have abandoned their usual song. It started with a whisper, rumors that spread through the streets faster than the night itself. A circus had arrived, but it wasn't the kind of circus that brought joy and laughter. No, this one was different. It wasn't on the outskirts of town, like one might expect, but right in the middle of Everwood, where no one had seen it coming. The circus tents, dark and twisted, had appeared overnight, as if conjured from thin air. The sounds of the raucous carnival, with its music and laughter, echoed in the stillness. But there was something wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It wasn't the usual joy one associated with a circus. It was a twisted parody, almost mocking in its cheerfulness. No one knew who had set it up or who was running it. The town's few remaining residents peered out from behind curtains and half-open doors, their curiosity battling with an unsettling sense of dread. They watched as figures dressed in outdated, tattered costumes moved about the grounds, but no one dared to step foot inside. Among those who had noticed the circus was Eliza, a young woman in her 20s with a taste for adventure. She had grown up in Everwood, and her life had always been routine until now. Her curiosity about the strange happenings that night was too strong to ignore. She was sitting in her small kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands, staring out the window. Her mind had been racing ever since she saw the circus tents just beyond the trees. She had heard the whispers of the old-timers, warnings about strange things that sometimes happened in Everwood, things no one could explain. She never put much stock in those tales, dismissing them as superstitions. But now she wasn't so sure. Her friend, Derek, had called her earlier that evening, sounding shaken. Derek wasn't easily spooked, but something had clearly unsettled him. He had been walking home from his shift at the local diner when he noticed the circus. At first, it seemed like any other carnival. But when he tried to approach, something stopped him. A cold, heavy feeling had settled over him, making it impossible to move forward. As he stood frozen in place, Derek claimed to hear a voice, a whisper, calling his name, but when he turned around, no one was there. "I don't know what to make of it, Eliza," he had told her over the phone. "It's like the circus is alive, like it's calling to me. It's not right. I'm telling you, there's something wrong." Eliza hadn't been able to shake his words from her mind. Now, as she stared out the window into the fog, she could see the faint outlines of the circus tents in the distance, just beyond the tree line. She had to go there, had to see it for herself. The pull of the unknown was too strong. She set her cup down and stood up, wrapping herself in a thick coat. A chill had settled over the town, and her breath came out in visible puffs as she stepped outside. The wind whispered through the trees, and the fog clung to her skin, damp and unnerving. As she walked down the quiet street, the distant sounds of the circus grew louder, a strange melody drifting through the night air. It wasn't long before Eliza found herself standing at the edge of the woods, looking at the shadowy figure of the circus in the distance. The tents loomed like dark sentinels, their colors faded, their edges fraying. The flicker of a dim light could be seen moving from tent to tent, but there were no crowds. There were no children's excited shouts or the laughter of adults. It was quiet, too quiet. Eliza's heart raced as she stepped forward, each footfall muffled by the fog that clung to the earth. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but this wasn't it. As she moved closer, she noticed the faint scent of something sweet, almost sickly. Cotton candy? but it was mixed with the scent of something else, something metallic. Blood? Her stomach twisted, but she couldn't turn back now. Her feet carried her closer to the tents, the eerie quiet of the place pressing in on her. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around her, making her hair whip across her face. She was close enough now to hear the faint sound of a drumbeat, deep and rhythmic, as though it was coming from within the circus itself. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the entrance of the largest tent. It was a man, tall and dressed in old-fashioned circus garb. His face was pale, almost unnatural, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted like something that had been forced. His teeth were too white, too sharp. "Welcome, Eliza," he said, his voice smooth and unnerving, as though he had been expecting her. Eliza froze, her heart pounding in her chest. How did he know her name? Before she could say anything, the man tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? It's time to see the show." His voice was softer now, almost a whisper, as if the circus itself was speaking through him. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and her pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But her feet remained glued to the ground. She wanted to speak, to ask him how he knew her name, but the words caught in her throat. The man stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "You've come all this way. Don't you want to see the secrets we've prepared for you?" As she hesitated, something caught her eye. Behind the man, in the depths of the tent, she could make out shapes moving, shifting like shadows. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her body moving of its own accord, drawn into the mystery. Just as she was about to enter, a loud crash sounded behind her, followed by an eerie, guttural laugh. Eliza spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The fog seemed to close in around her, and the tent loomed larger, darker, its entrance now wide open, waiting. Without thinking, Eliza stepped into the tent. As she crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the circus grew louder, more dissonant, more distorted. The laughter, once cheerful, now sounded like something else, something malevolent. The man disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone in the vast, empty expanse of the tent. And that's when she felt it. A presence, something that wasn't alone with her in the dark, something watching. The circus had begun, and Eliza was about to learn that not all shows are meant to end. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped deeper into the darkened circus tent. The air grew thick with a heavy, oppressive weight, and the distant sounds of carnival music now seemed warped, echoing unervingly through the canvas walls. The once familiar sounds of joy, laughter, cheers, and applause were replaced by an eerie distortion, like something was trying to call out to her from beyond the veil. The moment she crossed the threshold, the fog that had clung to the outside world seemed to vanish. The entrance behind her closed with a soft, final thud, leaving her in an impenetrable darkness. She could no longer see the man who had greeted her, the one with the chilling smile. The shadows around her were alive, twisting and writhing in ways that didn't make sense. They moved like they were not bound by the rules of reality. "Welcome to the show, Eliza," a voice said, but it wasn't the man's voice. It was different, darker, older, with an edge that sent a jolt of fear through her. Whipping her head toward the sound, Eliza could barely make out the outlines of strange, towering shapes in the dim light. Her breath quickened, and she took a few steps forward, the floor beneath her feet crunching oddly, as though something was scattering in the shadows. Her senses tingled, urging her to turn around, to leave, but her legs moved of their own accord, drawing her deeper into the tent. In the flickering light, she could now see that the circus was not empty. There were people here, but they weren't like any people she had ever seen before. They were pale, almost ghostly, their eyes blank and glassy. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, as though they were more like marionettes than human beings. Some were standing still, gazing into nothingness, while others wandered aimlessly, their heads tilting at odd angles. Eliza felt a chill crawl down her spine. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Something, some force, was keeping her there, pulling her deeper into the maze of strange, flickering lights. A soft, unsettling giggle echoed through the air, and Eliza spun toward the sound, her pulse racing. A woman stood nearby, her figure shrouded in shadow. Her hair was matted with what looked like dried blood, and her lips curled into a wicked grin. Her eyes were black, voids of darkness. "Do you like the show?" the woman asked, her voice silky and sweet, yet somehow filled with malice. Eliza opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She couldn't speak. The woman stepped forward, her movements graceful, almost predatory. "Don't be shy, darling," the woman whispered. "This show is for you." Before Eliza could react, the woman turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Eliza's heart pounded as she watched the woman's figure vanish into the shadows. Her mind raced. This wasn't right. Nothing about this circus was right. As she took another step forward, the distorted carnival music swelled around her, growing louder and more oppressive. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere, swirling through the air, surrounding her. The deep, rhythmic drumbeat seemed to match the pounding of her own heart. The music, once innocent, now felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. She moved quickly, trying to find her way out, but the circus didn't seem to have any clear paths. The tents were endless, the walls of fabric stretching as if the entire place was alive, shifting with every step she took. She reached out to touch the nearest tent pole, but her fingers brushed against something slick and cold, like wet skin. A shadow flickered to her right, and she spun toward it, but no one was there. The tent was silent, save for the eerie music that continued to play. Panic clawed at her chest as she turned to leave, only to find herself face to face with the same tall man she had seen earlier. His grin was even wider now, his teeth gleaming unnaturally white in the darkness. "You shouldn't have come, Eliza," he said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing. "This show, it's for you, yes, but it's not what you think." His words sent a shiver down her spine. Her breath hitched as she took a step back. "What do you mean? What's happening here?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The man's smile never faltered. "You're part of the show now. You're one of us." Before Eliza could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the tent, followed by the unmistakable sound of laughter. The laughter grew louder, harsher, more deranged, until it seemed to shake the very air around her. The man's expression twisted for a moment, and then he stepped aside, as if allowing her to pass. "Go on," he said, his voice colder now. "The show is about to begin." Her heart raced as she looked past him, toward the source of the noise. As if on cue, the lights dimmed even further, casting the tent in complete darkness. Then, a single spotlight shone down on a small stage at the center of the tent. On the stage, a figure stood, a figure Eliza could barely make out through the haze. It was a woman, her body twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, her arms bent at odd angles. Her face was distorted, a grotesque mask of pain and horror, her mouth stretching into a silent scream. The crowd, those pale, lifeless people, stood in eerie silence, watching the woman on stage. Their glassy eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply watched. Then, without warning, the woman on stage began to move, jerking unnaturally as if her body was being pulled by invisible strings. Her head tilted backward, and a voice, soft and otherworldly, echoed through the air. "Eliza," it whispered, the voice familiar yet alien, distorted by something dark. You are the key." A cold shiver ran down Eliza's spine. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she instinctively took a step backward. But there was nowhere to go. The circus was alive, its walls closing in around her. Before she could react, the figure on stage twisted violently, its limbs snapping into impossible positions. The crowd's lifeless eyes followed every movement, unblinking. And then, the woman's mouth opened, wider, impossibly wide, and a scream tore through the tent. It was a scream of pure agony, of suffering beyond comprehension. Eliza stumbled backward, her mind reeling as the scream reverberated in her bones. She wanted to run, to escape, but the air was thick, choking her. The tent seemed to grow darker with every passing second. And then, just as the scream reached its peak, everything went silent. The lights flickered. The air grew cold. "Welcome to the show, Eliza," the man's voice echoed from behind her. "It's time for you to take your place." The tent was still. The crowd remained motionless, their blank eyes fixed on Eliza. And in that silence, Eliza realized something. She wasn't just a spectator. She was the star of this twisted show, and there was no way out. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as the eerie silence settled over the tent. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The crowd stood motionless, staring at her with lifeless eyes. She could almost hear the beating of her own heart echoing through the void. Every part of her screamed to flee, to run from the suffocating darkness that enveloped her. But her legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath her felt sticky, as if the very earth was trying to hold her in place, to prevent her from escaping. "Welcome to the show, Eliza," the man's voice echoed through the silence again, smooth and mocking. "It's time for you to take your place." She tried to speak, to demand answers, but her throat felt tight, her voice strangled by an invisible force. She could only stand there, rooted to the spot, unable to move as the man's figure slowly emerged from the shadows. He was taller than she remembered, his presence looming over her like a dark specter. His face was obscured by shadows, but Eliza could feel the weight of his gaze upon her. His lips curled into that same sinister smile, one that made her blood run cold. "You're going to be the star of tonight's performance," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." A cold sweat broke out on Eliza's forehead as she looked around the tent, desperate for any sign of help, any way out. But there was nothing. The crowd remained still, their eyes fixed on her with unnerving intensity. And the woman on stage, her twisted, contorted form, was still there, her mouth frozen in that horrific open scream. Eliza swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what to make of this place, this circus that had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't real, couldn't be real, but the fear she felt in her bones told her otherwise. She had no idea how she had gotten here, or why she was the one chosen to play a part in this sickening show. But there was no denying the reality of it. She was trapped. Before she could process her thoughts any further, the music began again. This time, it wasn't just the haunting, distorted carnival tunes. It was louder, more aggressive, the sound crashing against her like waves of terror. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the tent, and Eliza could swear she saw movement from the corners of her vision. The woman on stage began to twitch, her limbs jerking unnaturally, as if someone was controlling her with invisible strings. Her face twisted further, her eyes bulging, her skin stretching unnaturally tight over her skull. The laughter from the crowd remained silent, but Eliza could feel the weight of their collective gaze, their eyes boring into her as the woman on stage writhed in agony. Then suddenly the woman stopped. The movement ceased, her body stiffening in place, and she tilted her head toward Eliza, her black, soulless eyes locking onto hers. "Eliza," the woman whispered, her voice like a rasp of dry leaves, "you can't leave. Not now. Not when the show has just begun." The words slithered into Eliza's ears like poison, and her blood ran cold. She tried to back away, but her feet remained glued to the floor. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as if the very fabric of the tent was closing in on her. The woman's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again, like a chant. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The entire circus, every person here, every twisted figure was part of some sick, demented performance. And she was the star. She was the one they had chosen to play the central role. Her mind raced as she struggled to break free of the invisible chains that bound her. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let herself be a part of whatever twisted spectacle was about to unfold. But no matter how hard she tried, her body refused to move. The man who had greeted her earlier stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, and the sensation sent a shiver through her spine. "Don't worry, Eliza," he said softly. "You'll be just fine. The show will start soon, and you'll be the star everyone's been waiting for." With a cruel, mocking laugh, he stepped back, disappearing into the shadows once again. Eliza was left standing there, her heart racing, her body trembling with fear. She had no idea what was happening, what this circus was, or why it had chosen her. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay here. She had to escape. But the tent was alive, and the moment she took a step toward the exit, a cold, bone-chilling wind swept through the air. The lights flickered violently, and the walls of the tent seemed to ripple like water. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and Eliza could hear the whispers of the crowd growing louder, closer, as if they were closing in on her. And then, as if on cue, the lights went out completely. Darkness enveloped her, a suffocating, all-consuming blackness. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen, unable to see, unable to move. The whispers in the darkness grew louder, more frantic, their voices rising in a cacophony of madness. The air grew colder, and Eliza felt a presence moving toward her. Something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for her. And then, a single light flickered on in the distance, cutting through the darkness. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure standing before her. A figure shrouded in shadow, its face obscured by a hood. "Eliza," the figure whispered, its voice cold and unfeeling. "The show is about to begin. You can't run anymore." Before she could react, the figure lunged toward her, and the world went black. As the figure's icy touch wrapped around her, Eliza's scream was swallowed by the darkness, and the circus fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Eliza's breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening with panic. The cold touch of the figure seemed to sink into her skin, an icy chill that wrapped around her like a vice. She was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. The darkness surrounding her was thick, pressing in from all sides. The oppressive silence felt like it was suffocating her. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming, caught in some kind of nightmare. But the coldness of the figure's touch, the weight of the air around her, and the overwhelming sense of dread told her this was no dream. The circus, the people, the twisted performance, everything was real, and it was all leading up to something far worse than she could imagine. "Eliza!" The voice came from the figure in front of her, its tone low and rasping, like a whisper carried on the wind. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its presence. Dark, ancient, and suffocating. Her body trembled, the fear creeping into her bones like poison. She wanted to run, to break free, but every muscle in her body felt like it was made of stone. "Eliza!" The voice repeated her name, softer this time, almost soothing, like it was trying to lull her into submission. But there was nothing gentle about it. It was a command, a summons, and Eliza knew that if she didn't obey, she would be lost forever. "You can't escape," the figure continued, its voice growing more insistent. "This is your destiny. The show is waiting for you." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating with a sense of finality. She had no choice but to play her part. She could feel the weight of the unseen eyes upon her, the eyes of the crowd, watching her every move. And the man, the one who had welcomed her to the circus, he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to step into the spotlight. "You belong to us now," the figure said, its voice like a dark promise. "The circus has chosen you. You will play your part, whether you want to or not." Eliza's heart raced as she tried to pull herself together. She had to think, to find a way out. She couldn't let herself be trapped in this nightmarish circus, a pawn in their twisted game. But the darkness seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder, the whispers growing louder, until they filled her ears, drowning out her thoughts. She felt the pressure on her chest, like something was suffocating her, pushing the air out of her lungs. Suddenly, a sharp, blinding light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the figure before her. Eliza's eyes squinted against the harsh brightness, and for the first time, she saw the figure clearly. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. His features were sharp, almost otherworldly, and his eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity. His skin was pale, nearly white, and his clothes were a mix of old-fashioned circus garb, with a faded red coat and a black top hat. The sight sent a chill down her spine, and Eliza couldn't help but recoil, taking an instinctive step back. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She couldn't keep the tremor from her voice, and she hated herself for it. But the figure seemed to be made of pure darkness, something that was beyond her comprehension, and it terrified her. "I am the ringmaster," he said, his voice smooth and silky, like a velvet trap. "And you, my dear, are my star attraction. You've been chosen." The words hit Eliza like a punch to the gut. The ringmaster? Was he the one behind all of this? The one who had brought the circus to town? Was he the one who had cursed her to be a part of this sick, twisted performance? "I didn't choose this," she said, her voice growing more firm, though her heart was still racing. "I didn't ask for any of this." The ringmaster smiled, and it was a cold, cruel smile that made Eliza's blood run cold. "No one ever asks for it," he said softly. "But that doesn't matter. You're here now and you're going to play your part. The show must go on." Before Eliza could respond, a loud, jarring noise echoed through the tent, a crash that made her jump. The sound seemed to come from the back of the tent, followed by the faint, unsettling sound of laughter. The laughter wasn't human. It was high-pitched, unnerving, like the sound of a child's giggle twisted into something sinister. The ringmaster's smile faded, and for a brief moment, Eliza saw something flicker in his eyes. A brief flash of something dark and malicious. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual calm demeanor. "I'll be back for you," he said, his voice low like a promise. "But first, I have other matters to attend to. Stay here and don't wander off." Before Eliza could protest, the ringmaster turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving her standing in the center of the tent, alone once more. The circus was alive. The very air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Eliza could feel it, the pulse of something ancient, something evil, vibrating beneath her feet. She could hear the whispers again, only now they were louder, closer, as if the spirits in the circus were closing in around her. She needed to get out. She couldn't stay here, but the darkness seemed to hold her in place, like an invisible force was keeping her from leaving. She tried to move, to break free, but the ground felt like it was sucking her in, pulling her back. The circus was a prison, and she was its unwilling prisoner. A flash of movement caught her eye. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw someone, standing at the edge of the tent. It was a woman, her face hidden in the shadows, but her eyes glinted in the dim light. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, cruel, and Eliza could feel the malice radiating from her. The woman raised her hand, beckoning Eliza to come closer. "Eliza," the woman's voice echoed. "The show has only just begun." As the woman's sinister smile widened, Eliza's heart raced, and her body screamed for her to run. But the woman stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and Eliza felt herself drawn toward her. The woman's presence was overwhelming. Eliza's legs felt like they were made of lead as she tried to move, but the pull of the woman's gaze kept her rooted in place. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavy with an eerie stillness that made it harder to breathe. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to escape, but her feet refused to obey. She was trapped. "Eliza," the woman's voice was soft, coaxing, like a siren's call, but it was laced with something darker, something she couldn't name. The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. Her eyes, though shadowed, glowed with an otherworldly intensity, flickering like embers in the dark. The sight made Eliza's skin crawl. "Come closer," the woman whispered, extending a long, bony finger in her direction. "There's something you need to see." Despite every rational thought telling her to run, Eliza's feet took a step forward. She couldn't stop herself. She was moving, slowly but steadily, towards the woman. "Who are you?" Eliza forced the words out, her throat tight with fear. Her voice felt small, fragile, in the face of the woman's terrifying presence. The woman tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "You'll learn soon enough," she said cryptically, her voice still sweet and mocking. "But not yet. Not until you've earned it. What do you want from me?" Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, her hands clammy. She didn't trust the woman, but the force pulling her in felt undeniable. It was like being caught in a trance, unable to break free. The woman chuckled, low and haunting. "I don't want anything from you, dear. You're already mine." Her eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from deeper within the circus grounds, followed by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. A shadow flitted past the edge of the tent, too quick for Eliza to make out. Her heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since entering the tent, she felt a spark of hope. Was someone else out there? Maybe there was a way out of this nightmare. The woman's expression darkened in response to the noise, her smile faltering for just a moment. Then, without a word, she turned away from Eliza and began to walk towards the source of the disturbance. Her movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, as she disappeared into the shadows. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Now was her chance. Without waiting for another second, she bolted, her legs finally obeying her frantic command to run. Her heart hammered in her chest as she sprinted through the tent, barely pausing to glance back. The circus had come alive in ways she couldn't understand. There were whispers, shadows, and strange noises coming from all directions. It was as though the entire place was watching her, waiting for her next move. She needed to find a way out, but every path seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the madness. As she rounded a corner, Eliza collided with something solid, sending her sprawling to the ground. Dazed, she scrambled to her feet, looking up to find herself face to face with a man dressed in a dark suit, his features obscured by the brim of a top hat. He was standing in the middle of the path, blocking her escape. "Eliza." His voice was a low, gravelly murmur, but the tone carried an unsettling familiarity. The show must go on. Eliza's stomach churned as she recognized him. It was the ringmaster, the man who had welcomed her into the circus. But now his presence was no longer comforting. His eyes, though hidden beneath the brim of his hat, seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. "Why are you doing this?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "What do you want from me?" The ringmaster's lips twisted into a smile, though it was devoid of warmth. "It's not about what I want, dear," he said softly. "It's about what you want. You've been chosen. You've always been part of the circus, whether you realized it or not." "Chosen for what?" Eliza's voice shook, the fear building inside her like a rising tide. She could feel the walls closing in, the darkness pressing around her. "You will see soon enough," the ringmaster said, his voice like velvet but laced with something sharp. "You are the star of the show, Eliza, and the show must go on." Before Eliza could respond, the ringmaster stepped aside, his dark eyes watching her with a mix of amusement and anticipation. Eliza hesitated, unsure of where to go or what to do. But she couldn't stay here, not with him, not with the circus pressing in around her. She turned and ran again, this time with more urgency, her feet pounding against the soft ground. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the circus seemed to warp and twist with every step she took. Shadows lurked in every corner, and she could feel them watching her, moving with her, as if they were part of the very fabric of the place. The light of the distant bonfire flickered through the trees, and Eliza made her way toward it, hoping to find someone, anyone who could help. But as she neared, the warmth of the fire seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive cold that made her skin crawl. At the edge of the clearing, she froze. The woman in the shadows was standing there, watching her with the same eerie smile. "Eliza," the woman called, her voice like a soft lullaby. "You can't run forever." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. There was no escape. The circus had her now, and there was nothing she could do. The woman took a step forward, and in the dim light, Eliza saw something she hadn't noticed before. Something that made her blood run cold. The woman's eyes were hollow, empty, like black pits of despair. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had been consumed by the very evil that permeated the circus. "You're part of the show now," the woman whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "And once you're in, there's no way out." The ground beneath Eliza's feet seemed to tremble, the earth shifting in response to the woman's words. It was as if the circus itself was alive, a living, breathing entity that was pulling her into its grasp. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as she realized the terrifying truth. The circus wasn't just a place, it was a trap, and she was its latest victim. The woman's figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, her laugh echoing through the trees. Eliza stood frozen, a chill creeping over her skin. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The circus had her, and the show was far from over. Eliza stood there, frozen in terror, her heartbeat pounding in her chest as she looked around in panic. The firelight flickered in the distance, but the warmth it promised seemed like a cruel illusion. There was no safety here, no escape. The circus had its grip on her now, and with each passing second, it was tightening. The woman's voice lingered in the air, an eerie whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Once you're in, there's no way out. Eliza shook her head violently, trying to block out the haunting words. She had to find a way to escape. She couldn't let herself be consumed by whatever darkness had taken hold of this cursed place. She spun on her heel and ran, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground, her breath ragged and desperate. The eerie laughter from behind her echoed through the trees, mocking her every step. She pushed herself harder, knowing that if she stopped, if she hesitated for even a moment, she might never escape. The path ahead was a blur of shadows, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and creaking in the wind. The circus, though distant, seemed to stretch endlessly behind her, its haunting presence looming large in her mind. She had to find someone who could help her, someone who could break this nightmare. As she stumbled forward, Eliza's eyes caught sight of something ahead. The faintest glow of light, like a beacon in the darkness, pulsed in the distance. It was a tent, one she hadn't seen before. The others were abandoned, but this one still held some semblance of life. Desperate, she sprinted toward it. As she neared the tent, her heart surged with a mix of hope and dread. Could this be the place she could finally escape? Or was it another trap waiting to ensnare her further? She reached the entrance and hesitated for only a moment before pushing her way inside. The dim interior was illuminated by soft, flickering candlelight. The scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic filled the air. Inside, the tent was unlike the others. It wasn't filled with the usual eerie performances or clowns. Instead, there were rows of chairs, each one occupied by a figure draped in shadow. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make out the faces. But the figures, no matter how hard she tried to focus, remained a blur, as though they were ghosts. "Eliza," a voice called out from the shadows. It was soft, familiar, and yet it chilled her to the core. She turned toward the voice, her heart sinking as she saw the figure standing at the back of the tent. It was the ringmaster. "Please," Eliza whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, I just want to leave. What is this place?" The ringmaster smiled, a slow, unsettling curl of his lips that made her skin crawl. "Leave," he chuckled, the sound like broken glass. "There's no leaving, my dear. Not until the show is over." The shadows in the tent seemed to draw closer, the figures watching her intently. Their eyes, though hidden, were sharp and cold, as though they were waiting for something. "What do you mean, the show is over?" Eliza asked, her voice small and trembling. The ringmaster stepped closer, his tall figure looming over her, his eyes gleaming with an almost predatory satisfaction. "You're the star, Eliza," he said softly, "and the show must go on. For you to leave, for this to end, you must take your place in the final act." Eliza's blood ran cold. "What do you want me to do?" The ringmaster's smile grew wider, his face twisted with a hunger she couldn't comprehend. "The audience is waiting, Eliza. They've been waiting for you. You just need to step into the ring." Her eyes darted around the tent. The figures, no, the audience, were leaning forward now, their presence growing heavier with each passing second. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was pressing in on her. "No," Eliza whispered, backing away. "I won't be part of this. I won't." But the ringmaster was already moving toward her, his long fingers reaching for her with a speed that was almost unnatural. "You have no choice," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've already taken the first step. You belong here now just as they do." Before Eliza could react, the audience, no longer just shadows, began to stand, their movements slow and deliberate. She could see their faces now, twisted in grimaces of malice, their eyes hollow and dark, as if their very souls had been drained away. Some of them were dressed in the same eerie circus costumes she had seen earlier, while others were dressed in tattered, ghostly rags. They were no longer people. They were something far worse. "Let me go!" Eliza screamed, trying to push past the ringmaster, but his grip was like iron, unyielding. With a sudden jerk, he pulled her toward the center of the tent, where an empty pedestal stood. The audience's eyes were fixed on her, their gaze unwavering. Their anticipation filled the air, suffocating her with its intensity. "You're the final act," the ringmaster whispered in her ear, his breath hot and rancid. "The circus has waited for you, Eliza. You'll take your place or you'll never leave." Eliza struggled, but her body refused to obey. She was pulled toward the pedestal, her feet dragging against the ground. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the terror was too overwhelming. The shadows of the circus pressed in on her, wrapping her in a suffocating embrace. The lights of the tent flickered, casting the scene in an eerie, ghostly glow. The audience remained still, their eyes unblinking. They were waiting, and then, in the midst of it all, a voice called out, soft, weak, but unmistakably familiar. "Eliza!" She turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood at the entrance of the tent. It was Daniel. Eliza's heart leaped in her chest as she saw Daniel standing in the doorway. But something was wrong. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, and the moment he stepped into the tent, the temperature seemed to drop. The ringmaster's grip tightened, a cold laugh echoing in the silence. "Isn't it a little late for him to be joining the show?" the ringmaster mocked. Eliza's mind raced as she stared at Daniel, her heart hammering in her chest. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she might have found salvation. But as Daniel stepped further into the tent, a cold dread began to settle in her bones. Something was wrong, so terribly wrong. His once bright eyes were now devoid of warmth, his face pale as if the life had been drained from him. The ringmaster's smile twisted into something darker. "Ah, another willing participant," he murmured, his voice dripping with malice. Eliza tried to take a step toward Daniel, but the ringmaster's grip tightened around her arm, yanking her back to the center of the stage. She winced in pain but refused to look away from Daniel. She had to warn him, had to make him understand that this circus was not what it seemed, that they were both caught in something far worse than they could have ever imagined. "Daniel, please," Eliza begged, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. This place, this circus, it's not real. It's all a trap. They won't let us go. We have to leave now." But Daniel stood motionless, his eyes empty as they stared at her. For a moment, she thought he might say something, that he might reach out to her. But then the shadows of the tent seemed to swallow him whole. He took another step forward, and Eliza realized he wasn't coming to help. He was being drawn in. "No," Eliza whispered, her throat tight with panic. "No, Daniel, please, don't." The ringmaster's laughter filled the tent, echoing off the walls like the sound of 1,000 mocking voices. "It's too late for him, my dear. You both are part of the show now. Welcome to the final act." Eliza's heart sank as she looked at Daniel, who now stood motionless at the edge of the stage. His once familiar features were now twisted into something monstrous, his body stiff and unnatural. The shadows around him grew thicker, and the air grew colder, as if the very life was being drained from the room. The audience, their faces still hidden in darkness, leaned forward, their eyes glowing with unnatural hunger. They were waiting for the show to begin. Eliza's stomach churned. They were not spectators. They were part of the twisted ritual, participants in the circus's dark games. "No, Daniel!" Eliza cried out again, struggling to break free of the ringmaster's hold. But it was no use. His grip was ironclad, and every attempt to move was met with a painful jolt. As she stared at Daniel, she realized the truth. The circus wasn't just a show, it was a curse that trapped anyone who came too close, turning them into puppets in a never-ending performance. And now she and Daniel were both ensnared. Suddenly, a soft, eerie music began to play in the background. It was slow and haunting, like the sound of a broken music box. The crowd, if they could even be called that, began to hum along to the tune, their voices blending with the music in a way that made Eliza's skin crawl. "Are you ready for your performance?" the ringmaster asked, his voice low and smooth, like a serpent's hiss. He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. "The show begins now." Without warning, the floor beneath Eliza's feet gave way, and she stumbled, almost losing her balance. It wasn't real, she told herself. This couldn't be happening. But as the ground shifted, she felt an unnatural force pulling her down, as though the very earth itself was alive and hungry. Before she could react, a sharp, cold wind blew through the tent, and the lights flickered wildly. In an instant, she found herself falling through darkness, tumbling uncontrollably. The wind howled around her, and the only sound she could hear was her own terrified scream. When she landed, it was with a violent jolt. Her body crashed to the ground, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The pain was overwhelming, but she forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. She was no longer in the circus tent. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the ground beneath her feet felt cold and wet. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her, the fog obscuring everything else. But the music still echoed in the distance, the same haunting melody that had filled the tent before she fell. "Eliza!" The voice was faint, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of recognition through her. It was Daniel. She turned toward the sound, her heart racing as she stumbled forward, desperate to find him. The fog seemed to swirl around her, thick and suffocating. "Daniel," she called out, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted a figure emerging from the mist. It was him, Daniel, but as he stepped closer, Eliza felt her stomach drop. His eyes were vacant, his expression lifeless. His clothes were torn and stained, and he moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. "No," Eliza whispered, her heart breaking. "Daniel, what happened to you?" He didn't respond. He only moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on her with an eerie intensity. And then, before Eliza could react, he lunged at her. She screamed, stumbling back, but he was faster, his cold hands grabbing hold of her arms with a grip like iron. His strength was inhuman, and as he pulled her closer, she felt a coldness seep into her skin, as if his touch was draining the warmth from her very soul. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice a distorted version of its usual warmth. "You're one of us now. You'll never escape." Her pulse thundered in her ears as she struggled, but it was no use. Daniel's grip was unbreakable, and the fog around them seemed to close in, trapping them both in its cold, suffocating embrace. And then, as if on cue, the eerie music began again, louder this time, as if signaling the beginning of something far darker. Eliza's eyes widened in horror as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a circus. It was a prison, and the show was far from over. Daniel's grip tightened around Eliza, his eyes hollow and unfeeling, as the fog closed in around them. She struggled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the darkness was swallowing her whole. Was this the end, or was there still hope? Find out what happens next in the chilling conclusion of the haunted circus. Eliza's body trembled as Daniel's hands tightened around her, his fingers cold like the touch of death itself. She gasped for breath, her lungs refusing to cooperate as she fought against the oppressive grip that seemed to drain all warmth from her body. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "You're one of us now," Daniel repeated, his voice an eerie echo of the person she once knew. "The circus has claimed you." The fog around them seemed to pulse with life, swirling like a living thing, closing in on them as if eager to consume them both. Eliza could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, and every step she tried to take was met with a force pulling her back into the darkness. It felt like the world was spinning, distorting into shapes and shadows she couldn't understand. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "I won't be part of this." "You're not him, Daniel." Her words seemed to have no effect on him. His grip only tightened, and his expression remained unchanged. There was nothing left of the man she had once known. This was something else entirely. The ground beneath them began to rumble, the earth shifting as if it were alive. The music from the circus, still faint but growing louder, echoed through the air, its haunting notes carrying a rhythm that was both familiar and unnerving. It was as if the circus was calling them back, urging them to take part in the final act. "Eliza," Daniel's voice was a whisper now, a sickeningly sweet tone that sent a new wave of dread through her. "There is no escape. You're already part of the show. You always have been." Tears filled Eliza's eyes as she looked around, her mind scrambling for any solution, any way out. But the fog had surrounded them entirely, and all she could see was the twisted figure of Daniel, his eyes dark and unblinking, his presence suffocating. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I won't let you take me." With every ounce of strength she had left, Eliza pushed against him, her hands pressing against his chest, trying to force him away. But it felt like she was pushing against stone. There was no give, no movement. It was as if she was fighting against the very fabric of the circus itself. Then, in an instant, the world around her seemed to shift. The fog parted, and the eerie music stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in from all sides. For a moment, Eliza was suspended in that eerie stillness, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then, the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A deep, echoing sound reverberated through the air, and Eliza felt her body being pulled downward. The world seemed to fall away beneath her, the ground giving way like the jaws of a great beast. She screamed, her voice lost in the void as she was sucked into the darkness below. For what felt like an eternity, she plummeted, her body weightless, her mind reeling. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the fall stopped. Eliza landed hard on cold stone, gasping for breath, her chest heaving as she struggled to regain control. She was no longer in the fog-filled wasteland. The space around her was vast, eerily silent, and as her eyes adjusted, she realized she was in an underground chamber, dimly lit by flickering torches that cast long, menacing shadows along the stone walls. The air was thick with dust, and the stench of decay hung heavy in the air. "Eliza!" The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. Her heart leapt in her chest as she turned toward the sound. There, standing in the shadows, was Daniel. But this time, he wasn't the puppet of the circus. This time, he was different. His eyes were wide and desperate, his clothes torn and ragged. He was real, he was herself again. "Daniel!" Eliza cried, rushing toward him. "I thought I lost you. We have to get out of here now." But as she reached out to grab him, the ground beneath their feet began to shake once more. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in on them, the ceiling groaning as if it were on the verge of collapse. Eliza's pulse quickened as she looked around, panic seizing her chest. There was no way out, no escape. The ringmaster's laugh echoed from the darkness, sending a wave of cold terror over Eliza. "You cannot escape, Eliza. You are part of the show, and the show never ends." Daniel's eyes widened in horror as the ringmaster's voice filled the chamber. And in that moment, Eliza understood. The circus was not just a place. It was a curse. A prison that held its performers, its victims, for eternity. And once you were trapped, there was no way out. The circus owned you. You belonged to it. "No," Eliza gasped, her hands trembling. "I won't stay here. I won't be part of this cursed show." But as she turned to face Daniel, the room around them seemed to warp and twist. The stone walls cracked open, revealing the twisted faces of the circus performers, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. They were closing in, their bodies contorting in grotesque ways, their laughter echoing in the space. Eliza fought to keep her ground, but she felt the pull of the circus growing stronger, its darkness consuming her once again. The music began to play, soft and haunting, as if luring her back into its grasp. And then, just as she was about to scream, everything went dark. Was this the end for Eliza and Daniel? Trapped forever in the circus's malevolent grasp? Or could they still find a way out? The final act has come to a chilling close, but there are still secrets left to be uncovered.